Welcome to New Planet School and the Python in Education series of videos. In this video, we're going to talk about reading from files, which is this video over here in the series. That's the one you're watching. And you can click on any of these boxes to jump to any of the other videos. And for your convenience, I will repeat this diagram at the end of the video. So let's get started. So why do we want to do this? In the other videos, I showed how to make graphs and so forth by putting the data values in lists or arrays, but often the data comes to us already on the computer. Could be that we calculated it somehow and saved it in a file, or we downloaded it from the internet or something, and so we want to be able to access that data. So what we're going to do here is look at two different ways that data might be stored, and those are in text files or CSV files, and those typically look like a name, for example, .txt, or CSV files might be some file name, usually .csv. And in a text file, often the things like the numbers or whatever it is might be separated by spaces. And obviously in a CSV file, they are comma separated values. That's what CSV means. Those are the two types we're going to look at. There's other types like binary files and so forth. We won't talk about those in this video. Okay, that's two different types of data we're going to look at. There are two things you might want to do with that. One is to read the file, which is to say get the data in and do something with it. That's what we're going to focus on in this video. We're not going to look at writing files in this particular video, so we can just focus on that one thing. So okay, and then there's another two in this introduction. There's two good ways of doing this. There's what I call pure Python, which uses the core Python language, or we can actually import a library from NumPy to do that as well. And in this video, I'm going to focus on the basic core Python tools because they're really quite powerful. But it isn't to say that some of the tools in NumPy aren't also really great, but I just wanted to keep the scope of this video a little bit limited, and the Python tools, like I said, are quite powerful. Okay, so let's get started by looking at a txt file and let's read in some data. So let's imagine we have a file. It has two columns, could be X and Y. You can call it that. And the way it works in Python is essentially these four steps. The first step is to open the file and tell Python that we want to read that file. So that's the first step. Open it and tell it we want to read. Secondly, we want to read in each line of the file. Now this phrasing here is actually really important. The way things work in Python, and one of the reasons it's so easy to use and so powerful, is this. It thinks of the file as a line followed by a new line, or character or return, whatever you want to call it, to the next line. And then that line, at the end of that line, there's a character that tells it to go to the next line. This is the way Python views a file. So when it reads in each line of the file, it reads from the beginning to the new line character and stops. Then the next time it starts here and reads the next new line character and stops. So it's reading lines. If you don't have any new line characters, it'll just read the entire file. So keep that in mind, because if you have a big file, that could take up all the memory on your computer. So keep in mind that this is the way that it looks at a file, which leads us to step 3 is then we have to then somehow separate the values on each of these lines. In other words, we got to go in and break this up and figure out what is the actual data. This could be strings or numbers or whatever, and we have to figure it out. That's why the type of file kind of matters, because if it's a comma separated value, that's really nice to know because we should look between commas. If it's a txt file, there may not be any commas, so it would make no sense to look for values between commas, and so you see why that's an issue. Okay, and then finally, the fun part is to go off and do something with that data. Okay, so let's do that. The first thing we want to do is open the file, and what we do is we specify a file name and we tell it that we want to read from it. Now I put the read part up here in a different color because it's optional. You can put that there or not. Sometimes it's good to have it there so when you look at your script later, it's easier to remember what it was that you were doing. Okay, Now you also need to know where your file is. You can be very frustrated if your Python script doesn't work because it can't find your file, because it doesn't know how to get to your file. So keep in mind that the Python script needs to know the path to get to your file. So sometimes you want to have your Python script and the file you're trying to read in the same folder or the same directory, so you don't run into this frustration of it not knowing where your file is. So keep that in mind. Now, because we're doing TXT files, text files as our example, we're going to have to know how to split that. Typically TXT files, because they're not comma separated value, they typically are breaking up the values on the lines by white space, which is either literally a space or a tab or something like that. There may be no commas in that file, so keep that in mind. All right, so let's give it a try. Let's get started. Okay, so here's a file with some strings and commas, and it's 2 columns. And so what I want to do is I'm going to read this in. I'm going to do it in different ways so you can see just how the whole Python philosophy works. So here's a little Python code. And let me walk through this. The first time I'm going to go through it kind of slowly. So the first thing we want to do is open the file. Okay. Here is the open command. Here is the path that tells me where in my directory structure it needs to go look. And then here is my file name, which is just called my file. And then, like I said, just to remind me, I put read here, but you don't need to do that. That opens the file located here for reading. Now what it does with it is kind of interesting. Notice this equal sign my file. What is that doing? What it's doing is it's creating what is called a file object. It kind of seems maybe like an abstract and strange thing to do, but it's actually a really convenient thing. What it does is it creates this object that from now on, in the rest of your Python script, you can refer to your file through this very simple name, my file. You don't have to keep telling it this very complicated thing and that you're reading from it. It knows all of that, and this is just like a little object that you can carry around with you. Very simple, and you can do things with it. And so it's a very convenient way to label your file, and it's called a file object. So once you have that object, you can now start doing things with it. So what we're going to do, as I said earlier, Python thinks about lines. So what we're going to do is loop over the lines in the file. Okay, so that's the next thing we're going to do. So here I have a for statement. This is the way you do a loop in Python, one of the ways of doing a loop in Python, using for. And the way it works in Python is you loop over a variable, lines, in some list. So the way to think about this is that this file object is your file, which is, as I said earlier, a series of lines. Okay, let's think about it that way. And so what this loop is going to do is it's going to go through each of those things in sequence. This is the first one, this is the second one, this is the third one, this is the fourth one. So it's a loop that goes through each of the things in the sequence, and with file objects, the thing in the sequence is a line. Okay, so this is going to loop over those lines. Okay, and then what's going to do, because it's for lines, it's going to put that line in this variable. Okay, so what happens next is, okay, let's draw that again just so we can be sure. Here's the lines. The first thing it's going to do is it's in this loop. Lines is going to get this first line. Okay, we want to do something with that, and that's a string. Okay, and it has everything on that line. So if we look over here, it's going to have all of this. That's the first line. It's the first line in the file. And then we need to do something to that. So that the next step is to split that line into separate things. And so Python has this nice command called .split. And you put parentheses because you don't need to give it an option. You just do .split, which operates on that object lines and splits it. And so what it's going to do is it's going to take that line, which in this case is this, and it's going to split it. And this is one of the reasons that Python is so powerful, is notice that we don't need to tell it very much about how we want to split it. And it's going to put the split line into this variable x. and it's going to automatically split this up for us. And then next, what we're going to do is we're going to print the first thing in this variable, and we're going to print the second thing in this variable. Now let me go through that again because it's kind of subtle and it's very important. What it does is it takes this line, it splits it, and when it splits it, it's going to figure out how many things there are in this line, and it's going to make this x be a list of the correct length, and the 0th element will be the first thing in the line, the first element will be the next thing on the line, and so forth. And so we don't even have to know in advance how many things are on a line. It'll automatically do it. In fact, we can afterwards ask for the length of x, and it'll tell us how many things it thought were on that line. Now, because we're doing a txt file, how is it going to split? It's going to split based on white space. So let's run this script and see what it outputs. Here is the output. And so what did it do? What it did is it looped through the file, so it went to the first line. It split it based on the white space. Here's the white space. Okay, so this is x0, this is x1. It printed x0 and it printed x1. So we got penny, comma. That was the first thing on the line, and zn, zinc, was the second object. Then it went to the second line, read that in, split it based on white space, wrote out the first object, wrote out the second object, right here like this, and then continued through the file until the file was done. Okay, so that is how it works. All right, now let's do another example. Suppose I add to the file some more values. So now I've added a third column. Here, CU, NI, all the way down is 3 columns. Now what happens? What I'm going to do is do the same thing. I'm going to loop over all the lines. This line, this line, this line, this line, this line. I'm going to split them. And because I haven't told it anything else, it's going to split based on white space. What's it going to do with the third column? So what it's going to do is it's going to take this X. It's going to split the line. And the first line, let me clear this up for you. The first line is going to look like what? What's going to go into X? What do you think is going to go into X? What it's going to do is going to just take penny. That'll be X0. And then it's going to put ZN for zinc. That'll be X1. And then CU would be X2. And then I print X0 and I print X1, and then I print just some dashes just to separate it. And then I loop through the whole file. In other words, I don't use x2 at all. And so let's see what happens. I get x0 is penny. That's this. x1 is zinc. Completely ignore this. It read it in, but I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm just going to print a dash line, and then I'm going to continue to the next line, where I get nickel here. Read in CU here. I read in the whole line, so I have NI there, but I don't do anything with it. And I just put the dashes, and then I continue through. So what this illustrates is one of the powers of Python is it reads in the whole line, and you can then split the line, break it up into the different pieces you want, and completely ignore the rest of the file. So imagine you wanted the first column and the third column. I simply don't use X1. Or if I want the second and third column, I simply don't use X0. And it's very flexible, as you can imagine, to use this strategy. Okay, now what about the commas? There were commas in some of those files. What did it think about the commas? So let's go through that quickly before we go to CSV files. So here's a file, 3 columns, only white space, no commas at all. This was the code. It looped through all the files. It split the lines, and it prints out the first column, prints out the second column, and prints out the third column. And sure enough, you can see it was reading in the third column all along. Okay, and there's no commas involved, but I can read in a line and break it up into as many pieces as I want. Okay, so this is using just white space and not commas. So what if we want to do a CSV file? Okay. The answer is, in Python, we can control what we want for the delimiters. And so let me show you this kind of funny example. Suppose I go back to my file and I add in some random commas. I put a comma here, I put a comma here, I put a comma here, here, and here. Suppose I do that and I run essentially the same code. What will I get out? Here's what I get from my output. Notice what happens. The comma, it meant nothing. It just said that is the first item before white space. And so if you go back over here, indeed, this is the first item before the white space. All it cares about is the white space. And then nickel, CU for here. The fact that there was a comma here didn't matter. Here, dime, space, CU, comma, space. Dime, CU, comma, space. So it just thinks the comma is another character. Okay. So what do we do if we want to do CSV files? So we want to do CSV. What we do is we go right over here in our file, and now we tell the split command what we want to split on. And we tell it we want to delimit the data in the file based on commas. And that's the difference from going from a TXT file to a CSV file, is putting that comma right there. Now if we run this script relative to this script up here, what happens? Very interesting. Look over here. Now we have PENN as the first item, and then we have Y space ZN space CU as the second item. Why did it do that? The reason it did that is it split based on a comma. So what it going up here, it said this is my first thing, so I'm going to put this in 0, and then after the comma, all of this to the end of the line is X1, because there's no more commas on that line. And the second example, let's look right here just to make sure I understand. All the way to the comma, who doesn't care about the spaces now, just like before, didn't care about the commas, sees a comma, that's the first X0, skips the comma, and then this is X1, which is right here. And so you can see a big difference based on whether the delimiter is a space versus a comma. And so we can handle both types of files. Okay, so now that we know how to read the data in from a file, we can split it up based on spaces, we can split it up based on commas, depending on how the file came to us. Now, how can we build up a data set that we can actually do something with? Okay, let's do that now. Okay, so here's my file here on the left. Okay, and I'm going to split this based on commas, as you can see right here. Okay, and then here's the output. So let me walk you through this, because this is a very important thing to be able to do when you're working with files. So let's do this very slowly. I'm going to open the file again, give it the path where the file is, and tell it we're going to read it and create a file object. Okay, hopefully we got that down. Next, we're going to set up two empty lists. So list one is a list. As you can see here, it's really two brackets. Doesn't quite look like it here. It looks like it's two brackets, and it's just an empty list. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this list. List 2 is also an empty list, and I'm going to fill it. And so you set this up before you do anything, and as you go through the file, we're going to fill up these lists, and then when we're done, we're going to do something with those lists. Okay, so here we go. We're going to loop over the lines in the files with this for loop. Okay, we're going to split the lines based on commas. So this is like a comma separated value type file. Okay, now here's the key thing we want to do next. We want to use this Python command called append. Okay, and append, what it does is it takes a list. Say you have a list, let's call it X, Y, and Z. What it does is it takes that list and appends to it another value. So if this were my list and I append to it X0, that would replace this with X, Y, Z, and then whatever is in x0 would be appended to that list. So the list just got a little bit longer. And so as we go through this loop line by line in the file, we keep adding to our to list, adding to it in the sense we make it longer and longer and longer. So remember that when we split the line, this actually creates a list. And the first one is x0, the next one is x1, and so forth, depending on the length of the line. And what we do is we're appending to list 1 whatever happened to be in x0, and we're appending to list 2 whatever happened to be in x1. In other words, list 1 is going to have the first column, and list 2 will have the second column, where the columns are defined by things separated by commas because I have this. Okay, and then at the end I print it just so that you can see exactly that that's what it does. So let's look at what it actually generated. What is list 1? List 1 is pen, which is the first column up to the comma, nickel CUN, which is, again, the first column up to the comma, dime space CU, first column up to the comma, and so forth. Quar, first column up to the comma. Similarly, what is list 2? List 2 is YZNCU backslash N. That's this, YZNCU. And notice it put a backslash N there. That's interesting. That is the new line character I was telling you about earlier. Next, I, new line character. I, new line character. In space, NI, new line character. That's this. And so you can see what happens. This is the first column, and this is the second column, where again, the columns are separated in this case by commas, because we're imagining that this file is a CSV file. Obviously, if this were a text file, we would not have put this in there, and it would have broken this up into columns based on spaces. And so it's a good homework problem to go run this with this part removed and to see what you generate for the first column and second column. We can take a file, we can read it in, we can break it up by either spaces or commas and build lists that correspond to specific columns of the data. So lots of progress. Okay, now notice that what I've been doing this whole time is using strings. And one of the reasons Python is so powerful at reading in files is it does everything in terms of a string. So it doesn't care what's there. It could be a number, it could be a negative number, it could be a real number, a complex number, it could be your name, it could be a color, it could be anything. And what it does is just throws it into a string. Okay, this allows us to bring in things from all types of files, including mixed files. So one of the examples I'll give later is where you could have strings and numbers in the same file. And that's really convenient because you may not know ahead of time what is a string and what is a number, because maybe you haven't even looked at the file. Maybe you've never seen it before. And that's often the case. Okay, so what if we want to perform mathematical operations on that data? It's really interesting what Python does. So suppose this is a file. Now notice it has numbers. Okay, that's the file. And then this is how I read it in. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to include matplotlib because I want to read in this file here, and I want to make a plot of these points. Okay, so I import the graphics library matplotlib. I'm going to call it PLT. I open this file and give it this file object, so I just need to carry this around with me from now on. I'm going to set up two lists, okay, and I want to put the first column in the first list. I'm going to put the second column in the second list, and then I'm going to want to plot one list versus the other. Okay, so as usual, I loop over all the lines in the file one at a time. I split the line based on commas. Okay, and then as I sequence through the file, I append my empty lists with what I just read in, first column and second column. x0 and x1. I'm going to print it just so you can see what it did. This is very interesting. And then I'm going to plot it using the standard matplotlib plot. I'm going to plot list 1 versus list 2 using blue circles connected by lines over this range and then show it. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. So here's the file. It works. It makes the plot. But what exactly did it plot? What it thought it plotted was this. This was list 1, and this is list 2. It actually plotted strings. And not only did it plot strings, it plotted strings where some of the strings actually have new line characters. So this is one of the beautiful things, is that matplotlib is smart enough to know what it was that you were trying to do. So if you pass it strings, it says, okay, well, I'm a plotting package and I'm going to make a graph and I'm seeing strings. What they must mean is that there's numbers in there, and it goes in there and it finds the numbers and throws away the rest and makes a perfectly reasonable graph. So it's kind of interesting. So you don't need to necessarily convert the strings to a number. Often you may want to do that, but matplotlib, for a simple example like this, is smart enough to figure out what you're trying to do. Okay. Let's now get to a much more realistic and much more fun example. So I wanted to have a good example. It was complicated enough but easy enough to play around with. I went to a website called Weather Underground, and I got this CSV file from them, which is all the weather information for the entire year of 2014 for the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I downloaded this file. And it's a big file, and it's not something that I would want to type in, so it represents a really good example. I happen to be using a Mac, and if you select a file on a Mac and you press spacebar, you get something that pops up that looks like this on the left. It looks kind of like a spreadsheet, and it's pretty intelligent. It figures out what's going on. And you can see the column. So here's the date, max temperature, mean temperature, min temperature, and it keeps on going. Dew point, humidity, sea level, so forth, visibility. It goes on and on. It keeps on going, precipitation and so forth. So this is actually really a lot of fun. You can go to Weather Underground, put in your own city where you live, download a CSV file, and start playing with weather and climate issues for where you live. It makes for a great science project. Now, if you actually go look at the file, it's not so pretty. This over here on the right is what the file looks like. And if you look at this, it's a little bit scary looking, and you may not want to deal with something like this. But the reason Python is so powerful is it can turn this into something that's actually very simple. Because what is Python going to do? What it's going to do is it's very simply going to take the first line and it's going to put it in a string. And then you can use split to break it apart. Take reads in the second line, you split it into different pieces and do with what you want with it. And then go to the next line, read it in, split it. And since this is a CSV file, we know ahead of time we're going to be splitting on commas. And when you look at this file, it's pretty obvious that all of these things right here in the file are actually split by commas. There's actually no spaces in here. So that's what we're going to do. It's actually, at this point, a very easy thing to do. So we're going to go from a CSV file directly to a graph. And so let me show you how to do that. Okay, so let me just walk through this. I'm going to import the routines I need to do the plotting. I'm going to in this case, I import NumPy. I usually always have these two things at the top of my scripts, whether I use them or not. In this case, I'm mainly going to be using Matplotlib. Okay, the next thing I do is open the file for reading and put it into this file object and then carry that around with me. And now the first thing I have to do is skip the header. Now, if you noticed, in the top of that file, luckily for me, it had all those labels. Maximum temperature, mean temperature, minimum temperature. Those are really great. So the first thing I want to do is just read that in, but don't do anything with it. So what I do is I simply take my file object and just tell it read a line. So this is something we haven't seen yet. It just says read that first line And whatever you get, put it in a string and put it into header. Okay, and then I just print it so that we can confirm that that in fact is what it did. But I'm not going to do anything with it. Okay. Next, what I'm going to do is loop over all the lines in the file. And this time, I want to keep track of a few things. So what I'm doing here is I have 3 empty lists that I make. And I keep track of what day I'm on because I want to, as I sequence through the file, I want to keep track. Is this the first day of the year? Is this the second day of the year? You might want to do it some other way, but that's the way I did it. So I have 3 empty lists and something that keeps track of the day that I'm on. Okay, then it's just like I showed you. I sequence through the lines of the file, that big mess. Every time I read in a new line, I increment the variable day so I can know which day I'm on. I'm going to split the line according to commas. And then I happen to know that the 2 things I want, the max temperature is in the second column, which was x1, because remember the first column is x0. The minimum temperature is in the third column, which is x2. And so I'm appending these 2 lists, filling them in with the max and minimum temperature. And then the day of year, this other list, I add to it the day. And so this is making a list that basically goes 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 365 when I reach the end. And then, of course, what I'll want to do is plot the maximum temperature and the minimum temperature versus this list. So I plot these 2 lists versus this list, and that's why I create it. So the rest of this is very straightforward matplotlib. I create a grid. I plot the maximum temperature versus the day of the year. I plot the minimum temperature versus the day of the year. I put some labels and some nice colors. Let's see what that looks like before I get to the bottom. Here's what that graph looks like. So I've gone from a CSV file that I got from Weather Underground. I went through all the lines in the file, filled up some lists, and made a graph with it. And you can grab this script and go get the data file for your town and look at other things. You can look at precipitation, cloud cover, all kinds of things, or even a completely different topic. And then just to make it look kind of nice, I use this command here called fill between. I really like this. And what I do is I fill between the max temperature and the minimum temperature for every day with gray. And so that gives me sort of this gray that's between the blue and the red. And the gray are the actual range of temperatures that were experienced throughout the entire year. As you go from winter when it's cold, here in the summer it's a lot warmer, pushing up towards 100 Fahrenheit, and then cools back down as you go into winter. So of course, what's so fun about this is we live in the age of information and data and big data. And so one thing I just wanted to call your attention to, because reading in this data and making plots is so educational, is this website, if you don't already know about it. It's called data.gov. It's put out by the United States government, which of course accumulates huge amounts of data, and because the taxpayers paid for it, they give it back to you. And so you can go down here and look at all of these amazing topics and click on these and get lots and lots and lots of really interesting data. It makes for really great projects. You can have a lot of fun with that. All of the scripts that are in here are at the New Planet School Google Drive. So if you want to play with any of the scripts that I have in here, don't worry about trying to look at the screen and trying to type it in. That would be very tedious. Okay, so with that, that brings us to the end of the video. Thanks for watching, and see you back here next time.